Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. So Trevor Connor is perhaps best well known for his career in cycling and more recently his contribution to coaching section of the Velo magazine, and of course you've probably heard him on Velo and Fast Talk podcasts. So after retiring at 38, in 2010 he started work with Dr. Cordain and he went Paleo, I believe. So like all good pros, he came out of retirement to become the top-ranked 40-plus rider in the country for several years. So I'm calling him a pro, but I guess need to get the definition of what a pro actually is, although definitely in my mind Trevor's a pro. In fact, he's fresh off the bike from the Tour of Tobago. So Trevor, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate this.
Excellent. And look, I would love to start with what is the actual definition of a pro? Because I know there's a bit of a pro card. If you don't have a pro card, then you're potentially not a pro. But can you explain your experience with cycling?
Yeah, cycling is a really unique sport. I'm not aware of any other sport that is like this. It would be as if football or cricket or any of these other sports, you could have amateur teams that even though they're amateur, can go and play with the professional teams at the professional events. That's kind of the way cycling is. So we have pro races, but within limits. Obviously an amateur team can't just sign up for the Tour de France, but for most of the pro races, amateur teams can go. So I raced the whole pro circuit for years. But initially, my focus was not to go pro. I really wanted to race for Canada. So I actually didn't take any opportunities to sign with pro teams. Later on, I did sign with a team called Team Rio Grande that I ended up managing. And it was a development squad. And we were always proud of the fact that we were the top-ranked development squad in America. And we, riders like TJ Van Garderen, Chad Haga, Taylor Finney, a lot of your top American pros came out of that squad. But because we had a development mission, even though we had a great budget and did all the races, we chose to never take that team professional. So really the only difference between me and a pro was that pros have a little card saying professional. I never got that card, but I was racing them every weekend.
And still living up to pro sort of cycling behaviour, I guess, with the Tour of Tobago that you just got back from. You sort of mentioned offline that you got 13th place at the first UCI.
Yep. Yep. So it's because it's the weekend after Worlds, it's the first UCI race of the new calendar. So technically, whoever wins it's the top ranked rider in the world. I always had this little fun mission of trying to win it in my 40s, so I could claim I was the only rider in history to be ranked number one in the world in his 40s, but never quite achieved it. I've been on the podium, but never won.
And at 46, coming 13th, not too bad.
I'm not upset about that. Let's put it that way.
and I believe that most of your time was also commentating as well. Yeah,
so I was playing a dual role at the race. I was both commentator and a racer, which balancing the two was a challenge, but a lot of fun.
Great. Well, Trevor, the reason I got you on the show is because I have heard and read your papers and I'm very intrigued about your thoughts around a few controversial issues regarding cycling, but also just athletes in general. If you don't mind, I'd love to start with cramping. So why does cramping occur and how do we prevent it or treat it?
We, as you know, we recently did a podcast on this and actually wrote an article on it a few years ago. And I love this one because this is an example of you talk to most endurance athletes and they are convinced this is an electrolyte issue. This is a dehydration issue. And as soon as they get a cramp, they're taking some sort of electrolyte pill. And that's just kind of common knowledge. And the fact of the matter is there's no science backing that. It came out of very old researchers, research. I'm not even sure you want to call it research, but it was basically they were looking at workers on ships who were having cramping issues, and they saw that they were getting dehydrated, that they had some electrolyte imbalances. So because of the association, they said, well, that must be what's causing the cramping. But they never really tested to say, hey, is there any evidence that this causes this? The top researcher on the subject is a Dr. Schwellnus. who back in the 80s and 90s wanted to prove that it was electrolytes, and in the process of trying to prove it, actually did the exact opposite. So he did a bunch of studies on people who are cramping, which is tough because you can't bring somebody into a lab and say, well, cramp. You can electrically induce a cramp, but that's a little bit different. So he had to be very creative, and he used, I believe, an Ironman, had a whole bunch of athletes sign up, knowing that if he had 300 athletes sign up, some of them were going to cramp, and tested their blood, did a whole variety of tests on them, and found that electrolyte imbalance had zero correlation. So as he continued his research, he came up with what was called the altered neuromuscular control theory. And really what's going on, the short version is we have these bodies in our muscles. So we have muscle spindles and Golgi tendons. And they are localized organs that sense stretch in the muscles or contraction in the muscles and prevent the muscle from over-contracting or overstretching. So if it starts feeling too much of a stretch, it sends a signal to the nervous system to get the muscle to contract and prevent damage, and vice versa. Normally, these two organs are in balance, so they prevent your muscle from over-contracting or being overstretched. What happens with a cramp is they get out of balance. And eventually there is too much of a contraction signal sent to the nervous system and not enough of an inhibitory signal, and your muscle just clamps down. It contracts, and it's quite painful. A couple key things to know is this only happens when the muscle's in a shortened state. So, for example, if your hamstring cramps, it's only going to cramp when your knee is bent. So one of the ways to help resolve it is straighten the leg. And stretching will always help get rid of a cramp, because that lengthens the muscle. But that's really what's causing cramping. It's not electrolytes.
Interesting. So then would stretching often help prevent cramping?
Theoretically, stretching is going to help you. Actually, we never really discussed that when we were lucky enough to talk with Dr. Schwellnus about this. But certainly, if you have tight muscles and you're keeping them in that shortened state, that's going to lead to cramping. So I would imagine stretching the muscles is going to help prevent it. But ultimately, what leads to cramping is muscle damage. What gets it out of balance, what gets these two, the Golgi tendons and the muscle spindles out of balance, is damage to the muscles. So it's kind of a mean way to say it, but generally if you're cramping a lot, it's kind of a fitness issue. And that's why a lot of athletes cramp in the early season or their first couple races, because they're not used to the intensity. It's very damaging to muscles, and their muscles just aren't ready for it yet.
So how would you prevent it?
What I do with my athletes, sorry, I'm hesitating because there's a whole bunch of different things. I'm going to give you my belief on this, and then I could certainly go through some of the list of other things. But for me, when I have an athlete who's cramping a lot, I do a variety of things. One is I get them into the weight room in the off season to help build the strength of that muscle and the resistance of the muscle to any sort of damage. Particularly, I try to get them to do some eccentric work. So I'll get them in the gym. I'll do a little plyometric work with them. They'll certainly, when you start the plyometric work in the winter, the next day they're going to be sore and they'll cramp a little then. But the idea is then you're not going to cramp in your races. I try to do a lot of endurance work. I've personally found athletes who cramp more tend not to do those longer rides where they teach their muscles how to continue to work when fatigued. And then as you're getting close to the season, you need to do some really high intensity work to prepare your muscles for how brutal racing can be.
Excellent. So is there any other little tricks that you perhaps even don't use but have heard of?
Well, so obviously the stretching's a big one. And when you do cramp, the best thing you can do is stretch that muscle. I've experienced a cramp actually for the first time a couple years ago. And I know where the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendons are located, and there's a big cluster of them. I basically just jammed my thumb into that location to try to change that neuromuscular imbalance. And that actually helped to resolve some of the cramp. That's certainly not what I'm gonna teach my athletes as the primary prevention, but certainly getting off the bike and stretching. Or if you're starting to cramp and you're in a race, if you have a downhill stretch, try to stretch out the muscles. And if you watch Tour de France, you'll see athletes actually doing that, getting out of the saddle and trying to stretch the quad or stretch your calves. Strangely, another one that's proved really effective is pickle juice. And I think that when they saw that it was effective, that proved for a lot of people that it was electrolytes, because pickle juice is obviously very high in salt. And it was a very unique experiment where a researcher took pickle juice and then water with an equivalent level of sodium in it and tested that on athletes who were cramping and found the water sodium mix had no effect. So it was actually a chemical. What's that?
So it's the actual spiciness.
Yeah, there's another, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there was another chemical in the pickle juice that actually affects our neurological system, and it prevents that neuromuscular imbalance.
Okay. And Trevor, have you heard of mustard working?
I have a vague memory of that, but I couldn't really speak to it at all.
Right. Excellent. And the other question I had around cramping was, you hear of some athletes and even non-athletes getting cramping at night in bed. Is that a different type of cramping?
That is. And when we spoke with Dr. Schwellness, that's where a lot of his research is heading, that there is sports cramping, which is due to causing a lot of damage to the muscles and fatigue in the muscles. And then there's another form of cramping, which is more health related. And he was very big, and he really wanted to make this point that if you are cramping frequently, and it's not just, hey, I'm at the end of a 4-hour race and I'm cramping, you have an obvious cause like that. But it's things like cramping at night or cramping quite frequently when you're not doing a ton of damage to the muscles. He says go in and see your doctor, because there are other causes and you need to get evaluated for those.
Okay, excellent. So before I move on to another controversial issue, have you got any other comments or sort of advice for people around cramping?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's it. And people hate me, frankly, when I tell them this stuff, because they want to hear take an electrolyte pill and you're going to be fine. What I am telling athletes when they cramp in races is you have essentially a fitness issue and you need to work on that, which is a lot harder. So
not quite as easy to fix. You mentioned dehydration and that not being a factor, but what are your thoughts around hydration, especially like long races, endurance races or trainings? I guess I wanted to ask you about hydration in terms of like Tim Noakes's sort of suggestions in his waterlogged book, as well as just anything else that's out there at the moment.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I don't have in any way a definitive answer for you. I've been trained in science, so there's no definitive answer on anything. It's all theory. But on the relative scale, this one is even less clear than a lot of other questions, because it has been changing a lot. Obviously, as you know, 10, 15 years ago, it was all about hydrating. We're not hydrating enough, drink more. And then you started having people get hyponatremia, and actually had some very unfortunate cases of people in marathons dying from overhydrating. So they've gone back and really questioned our theories about hydration. And what they're finding is, from everything I've been reading, and I'm trying to keep up on the research, it's just there's strong opinions on either side. But they're finding a lot of the advice that we thought was really good advice, like the drink, was it 8 cups a day of water. When they spoke to the doctor who came up with that, he basically said it just sounded like a good number. There was no science behind it. They're finding, I pulled up a bunch of studies where they intentionally dehydrated athletes to see if it would affect time trial performance. So this wasn't long endurance rides, but this was time trial performance, and found that they could dehydrate athletes a fair amount, 4 or 5%, and have zero impact on their performance. And as a matter of fact, there's some teams now that Team Sky is claiming they're doing this, but Team Sky makes a lot of claims, but actually intentionally dehydrating their climbers to the, that 3, 4, 5%, So we're not to the point where it affects their performance, but to the point that when they're hitting that final climb in the race, they are lighter.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that, and I was hoping that wasn't the reason, but
that is the reason. I'm not sure I personally want to go down that road. The race last weekend, because you're racing in 35 degrees Celsius heat. I certainly unintentionally experimented with it, but no, it's not something I would want to do purposely. But there are certainly now people coming out saying that we shouldn't be hydrating at all in races. And other people that are saying, no, we still need to hydrate a lot. So there, in the science community, there's people on all sides. And as you pointed out, Noakes wrote a whole book about the fact that we are overhydrating. The one important point I think to make here is these people who are suffering from hyponatremia, these are not the elite marathon runners. These are not the high-level cyclists. It is the people who are recreationally doing marathons where they're really walking most of it. They're carrying a water bottle with them, and we're very concerned about hydrating, and we're drinking tons of fluid and actually not sweating out a lot. So the people who are racing hard and performing at a high level, so if you're at the weekend race and you're at your limit, hyponatremia is not something you need to be worried about.
Okay. So I guess you're somewhere in the middle, or it's just a bit too hard to even make a call on the science at the moment.
I think there is a big individual side. I think a good rule is to try to finish a race or a long ride. I like the idea of checking your weight. And you will always be lighter at the end of the ride, but you only want to be like a kilo lighter or a couple pounds lighter. If you do a long ride and you come home and you're 12 pounds lighter, or what's that, 3-4 kilograms lighter, you dehydrated yourself. And that's something you should probably avoid.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned, sorry, you're going to finish that?
So we'll go ahead, and then there's another point to bring up with that. So
tell us about that.
So there's an effect in cycling that a lot of people don't know, or any sort of endurance sports. And you started the question with asking about long training rides or long races, called cardiac drift. The basic concept here is, so we'll talk about it in terms of cycling. Let's say you went out and did a 5-hour ride and you just locked in at 180 watts. You might start that ride at 130 beats per minute. By the end of that ride, you might be closer to 140, 150 beats per minute. Your heart rate is going to slowly rise relative to the power you're putting in. And that's called cardiac drift. There's a few things that contribute to cardiac drift, but one of the biggest ones is dehydration. And what that means is it does affect your training. Training at 180 watts at the start of a ride has a different physiological impact than 180 watts at the end of a ride. So if you are dehydrating, you are affecting stroke volume, you are affecting blood delivery, you're affecting vasoconstriction, and that can negatively impact your training. So that right there is a reason to try to maintain blood volume when you're training.
Yeah, right. And what if you have a tendency to sweat a lot? Would you then potentially need more water?
Yeah. So I remember back 2008 Olympics in China, they were extremely worried about the heat because where it was in China is known for being very hot in the summer. And at least up in Canada, and I was training at the Canadian National Center at the time, so we were doing a lot of studies on this, really trying to figure out every athlete's sweat rate. And then the idea was to try to replace what they were sweating out. So people who sweated more, they would want to hydrate more. Also looking at the concentration of the sodium, potassium, and other electrolytes that they're losing in their sweat, and then try to customize their drinks to replace exactly what they were losing. So they put a lot of research into it. And of course, when the race came around, it was pouring rain and cold.
Right. So no real outcomes then.
I mean, there has been a lot, and they do that a lot with athletes. And I do think there is a value. You can certainly find this in a lot of locations, people who will do a sweat analysis for you. For most people who sweat normally, don't really worry about it. Get a good drink mix And a good drink mix will have similar osmotic pressure to typical human sweat. Remember that our sweat is hypoosmotic, meaning that compared to our blood, we sweat out proportionally more water than electrolytes. So over time, if you're getting a lot of sweat, your blood is going to become very concentrated with electrolytes. So what you don't want to do is drink a fluid that's also containing electrolytes. You want to drink a fluid that's actually less concentrated than your normal blood concentration. That's called osmotic pressure. When you do a sweat analysis, they're going to tell you the concentration of your sweat. It can be valuable, especially if you're a heavy sweater, to go and get a sweat analysis so they can determine what's the concentration of your sweat, so that you can hope then create a drink mix for yourself or mix your drink mix in a way that it somewhat approximates your sweat. So, for example, if you're a heavy sweater and you're almost entirely getting rid of fluids but has a very, very low osmotic pressure, you probably want to then mix a less concentrated drink mix.
Got you. That's interesting. And can you share your knowledge, if you have any, around sweat and its relationship to fitness or health?
And I haven't done a ton of research on sweat, so please take everything I say here with a grain of salt. But I'm not too aware of any dramatic relationships, except for one of the major adaptations that you see in endurance athletes as they become fitter is they become more efficient sweaters. Basically, the reason we sweat is so that our body can evaporate the fluid, and in the process of evaporating the fluid, get rid of heat. So any sweat that drips off of your body is wasted sweat because you evaporate. So as we become fitter, our bodies become very efficient at sweating just the right amount that it all gets evaporated. So if I see somebody who's sweating a lot, it's typically somebody who is new to the sport and hasn't developed that level of fitness. The one addendum to that is when we all are placed in a hot environment, we all become less efficient sweaters. We start sweating more and you start seeing it drip off your body, and that's even Tour de France athletes, that it's true for them. And I never got a good answer of why that is. It seems like a poor adaptation on our part.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because I live in a very hot environment and people sweat like crazy. And even people that I would consider very healthy and very fit, perhaps even sweat more than those that aren't. So,
yeah, that's, like I said, that's one of our adaptations to heat. And I remember when I was doing my master's and we did our environmental extremes course and we were talking about heat, and that the fact that is a major adaptation to heat. You start sweating like crazy, over sweat, so that it just drips off. We talked in the class about why that is, because that's all wasted sweat, and never really had a good explanation of what is the evolutionary reason behind this. It seems kind of wasteful.
Interesting. Look, I've got so many questions for you. It's hard to narrow things down, but I really want to talk to you about warming up before races. And I know I've heard you talk many a time, and I know the answer is always it depends. But warming up before a race, how would you advise people to do that? And obviously it's going to depend on the race, but maybe you could give us a couple of different scenarios.
Well, I really enjoyed, when I wrote an article about warming up, I really enjoyed doing the research, because it was one of those ones where I felt I had a pretty good grasp of the science behind warming up, and got all of my knowledge completely flipped on its head. With like going through the research going, wow, I had been telling my athletes the wrong thing. Basically, what is coming out in the new research is people do too much of a warm-up. And it's actually surprising how little you need. So a couple things to know about is most of the research on warming up has been for track style events. So 400-meter runs or 100-meter runs or track cycling. They don't do a ton of research on warming up for long road races, because very early research on warming up, they showed that really the effects of a warm up disappear after about 5 to 10 minutes. Meaning you do a warm up, do no warm up, 10 minutes into the race, you're going to be in pretty much the same place. So the warm up really affects the beginning. If you're doing a 5-hour road race, you just don't really need a warm up unless there's a client and you know they're going to be absolutely hitting it. And I can tell you, when I was going to pro races and we had 5-hour races, all the pros were sitting there in lawn chairs just talking before the race. And they might get on their bike a couple minutes before the event to spin the legs for a minute or two, and that's it. So really, when you're talking about a warm-up, it's for those shorter events, like you're going to be doing a 20-minute time trial, or you're going to be racing on the track where you need to be at your best within a minute or two of the start. And this research that really flipped things on its head for me compared traditional track-style warm-ups, which pretty involved. The traditional warm-up is around 40 minutes-ish, and something like doing some ramp-ups and then maybe a 3, 4, 5-minute effort at threshold. Then a series of sprints, and pretty hard sprints, and maybe 4, 5, 6 sprints. So you're doing a lot of work in that warm-up. I read several studies where they compared that warm-up to a much smaller warm-up of maybe 20 minutes where you mostly run easy and then just do 2 sprints. And the smaller warm-up consistently in this research proved better.
Yeah, that's really interesting and obviously different to what you previously thought.
Yeah, so I've always been somebody who does a very long, relatively hard warm-up. So it was hard research for me to read. Because I'll admit, I used to watch the guys who would just sit around and then maybe do 1 or 2 sprints close to the event, and that was it, and just go, oh, you guys are going to be hurting yourselves. You're not going to perform at your best. And it turns out, no, actually, I was making the mistake. They were doing the right thing, or at least that's what the research is saying. Certainly this year, I experimented with it when I was doing time trials and other events. I went, okay, let's give this a try, and I'm just going to do a 15, 20-minute warm-up, a couple quick sprints. And I used to always try to finish my warm-up within 7, 8 minutes of the start of the event, pretty close to the start. And that was another thing that they said in the research is you need at least 12 minutes from your warm-up to the start of the event to let your muscles recharge their energy stores. So I started doing that, 20-minute warm-up, couple sprints, finish 12 minutes before the event, and lo and behold, I was performing just as well, if not better.
Very interesting. And what about for those athletes that potentially are coming back from injury, say they've got ankle or hip issues and they feel that they need a bit more of a longer warm-up? Is that just a myth?
That's a good question. And this is I always quote the research and I rely heavily on the research, but I will still say in the end, you have to experiment. You have to find what's right for you. And if you find that through experimentation, this thing, even though it contradicts research, works best for me, you go with that. It could very well just be mental, but don't underestimate the importance of having yourself in a good mental place. But certainly, if you have an injury, it might take longer to get the muscles moving. More importantly, get the proper neuromuscular firing pattern. For those people, whenever I have an athlete who's coming back from an injury, I do a lot of neuromuscular training with them to get the firing patterns right again.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I had a double hip operation 4 years ago, and I still find that before I didn't need to warm up at all, but now I feel like I do need like at least sort of 10, 20 minutes before trying to sprint.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I've gotten very interested in the neuromuscular side training. What got me interested in it was I worked in a biomechanics lab for a few years, and we were at walking patterns. We were actually working with obese people and trying to figure out how to help them get exercise without getting injured. Because
when you have somebody who weighs 400 plus pounds, even just walking can cause injury. So we are trying to figure out what they could do that would have low impact. The side benefit I got out of all this research was seeing just how complex the muscle firing pattern was for any sort of movement, whether it's the cycling pedal stroke, whether it's walking, whether it's running. And more importantly, that there are all sorts of different ways of producing the same movement. There's just some are more efficient than others. So there's a lot of ways to get your knee to bend when you walk. And when we have the ideal, but if you can't use the ideal, like let's say you injure a muscle, your body's amazing at using other muscles to produce the same movement. You're just going to be weaker. And if you continue to use those secondary firing patterns, eventually you're going to get injured. So the reason I'm explaining all that is when you do get an actual injury, or in your case, you have surgery and you come back, you see a lot is you stop using the ideal muscle firing pattern and you start relying on the secondary patterns, and you have to retrain your whole neuromuscular system to start firing correctly again. And just continuing with that, so I'm just thinking out loud here. When you are warming up for a race, doing some neuromuscular work, because again, your body doesn't as easily get into the proper recruitment patterns after an injury. You might need that longer warm-up time to get the neuromuscular patterns correct. And I would be doing cadence work, a lot of spin-ups to help get the firing pattern going again.
That makes sense. I love the article that you wrote, just moving on here, about lactic acid and debunking those myths. Can you tell us a bit about lactic acid and what people think and what's the truth?
I will tell you, I've been writing articles 7-8 years now for VELONEWS. I have never been attacked for an article as much as I was attacked for that one. People just did not want to hear that. It was an interesting one, and I felt pretty beat up, but I did end up with one of the best vindications ever, which I'd be happy if you want me to tell you about in a minute. But the basic idea here is people talk about lactic acid, and the old belief was that burn that you feel when you're going really hard is lactic acid buildup. And the gist of my article is debunking that and explaining why lactic acid actually does not exist in the human body, or at least it does not exist at physiological levels. And I will tell you, acid chemistry is very, very complex, so I am really simplifying this. But when you talk about an acid, so any chemical that can exist in an acid form can also exist in a base form. So in this case, we have lactic acid and we have lactate. Lactic acid obviously is the acid, lactate is the base. All of these acids have what's called a pKa value. And that is when it's a fluid like water, the pKa value is the pH of the fluid where the chemical will exist 50% as an acid and 50% as a base. And sorry, like I said, this is really complex, so if any of this is unclear. The pKa value for lactic acid is 3.67, meaning you have to have a very low pH, a very acidic fluid, to have it exist even 50% as lactic acid. In the human body, pH of our blood will not, unless you are sick or in serious trouble, your pH is not going to drop below about 7 or 6.9. So at the physiological pHs of our blood, lactic acid essentially cannot exist. That makes sense?
Yeah, totally. But where does the myth come from then?
So the myth comes from, when they first identified lactate, that was over 100 years ago, I believe now. And acid chemistry was really in its infancy. And back then, they didn't even understand that a chemical could have both a base form and an acid form. So they correctly identified that when you were working really hard, you had a buildup of lactate in the blood. The other thing that they saw in the blood was the pH would drop. So there was a buildup of acid. So they went, well, lactate's building up, the pH is dropping, so you're producing lactic acid. But there's a correlation. What's actually happening is it's related to the transport system in our cells. Our cells, they do produce acid, they basically produce hydrogen ions. And whenever you're talking about an acid, ultimately what you're talking about is hydrogen ions. And again, I won't go too far down that rabbit hole of explaining that side of acid chemistry. But you get a buildup of hydrogen ions, and cells need to get those hydrogen ions out of the cell in order to continue functioning. And that's actually hard to do because you're pushing them against the concentration gradient. It's actually very easy for the cells to pump lactate out of the cells. So we have a co-transporter in our cells that pump lactate out of the cell. The lactate essentially carries the hydrogen ion with it. The simple way to think of this is you are pumping lactate and acid out of the cell with the same transport. So lactate, it's not a case that you're having a buildup of lactic acid. The lactate is actually helping the cell to continue to function.
Absolutely. And look, that was a really good explanation. And to be honest, if someone's not clear, your article definitely makes it clear. So yeah, I think you summarized that really well. But I have to ask you about the vindication that you got from it.
There's a Professor Brooks who, for a lot of us in the physiology world, he's a bit of a hero. He was the person who really did the groundbreaking research on lactate and proved that it wasn't this dead chemical that we could clear out, but actually lactate is a fuel and very, very important to our bodies. It serves a whole bunch of functions. He did all that research and is quite famous for it. So when I wrote this article, like I said, I got attacked and I spent a week responding to these attacks and just thinking, I wish I had never written this article, just getting beat up. So one of the professors in my department was friends with Dr. Brooks, and he got an email from Dr. Brooks with a copy of my article. And the subject heading of Dr. Brooks' email was, somebody finally got it right. So my professor forwarded that to me and said, I thought you'd want to see that. And to have Dr. Brooks actually read my article and say, this guy got it right. They took it from an article absolutely regretted to one of the articles I was the most proud of that I've ever written.
That's awesome. So what's the latest research that's really surprised you the most in terms of totally changing the way you thought beforehand, in terms of performance or diet or health?
Certainly the warm-up research flipped things for me. So that was the most recent one, but we've already covered that. Another one that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is recovery research. There's two reasons. The first reason is what's coming out as being effective in recovery and not effective in recovery surprised me. Massage, there wasn't a lot of research showing benefits. Stretching, no real benefits. Here was a really surprising one. Doing a cooler race was actually counterproductive. There's research showing that you're actually better off finishing the race and getting straight off the bike. That one was very surprising to me. Things that have been shown to be beneficial, foam rolling, that one actually wasn't a surprise to me. But one that killed me was compression clothing, because I used to talk against compression clothing. Another one that's not beneficial is icing or any sort of cryotherapy. So getting into cold bathtubs or icing muscles when they're injured are actually is showing to be somewhat counterproductive. So that was the first part that was surprising. The second part of the recovery research that was very surprising to me is when I spoke with people who were doing research on recovery modalities, they said there's actually a big issue with the research. The fact that it is low funding, they can't get the numbers. So really, I literally talked to somebody who had been researching massage for a long time and wrote a whole review paper on all the different recovery modalities. And he just flat out told me, you really can't trust any of this because we can't get numbers to see a true effect. What I also got out of that is all these different recovery modalities. It's not really that scientific. It's really based on experience and what people think is and isn't effective. And we really don't truly know what is beneficial and what isn't. But a lot of it is probably long-standing myths that we might need to reconsider. Like, for example, everybody thinks these ice baths are beneficial for you. And there actually is research showing that it slows recovery and can cause scarring.
And then I guess also all of this research isn't really considering longevity as such. It's just talking about recovery for the next race.
Right. So a lot of the massage research, when you actually dig into it, you kind of wonder if this is athletes that are, or people that have any experience with sport doing the research, because there are a bunch of studies that came out and said no benefits to massage. And you look at their study and it was, well, we gave the athlete a massage and then we had them do a time trial and their performance didn't improve. And you go, well, that's not the purpose of massage. You're missing the point here. It's about getting through a long season. It's about avoiding injury. You're completely testing the wrong thing. Nobody ever said a massage is going to make you faster in a time trial right afterwards.
So is that the type of research that they were doing? They were just giving them a massage and then saying, right, go and do a sprint.
Or go do a 20-man trial and see no benefits. Go, who does that? There's no single race teams on the massage table right before a race. So really what was surprising there, what the lesson for me there when you look at the recovery modalities is to be careful about reading methodology and looking at the research, because there are review papers out there right now saying a whole bunch of research been done on massage, no benefits. But then when you actually dig into those specific studies, you see that they really don't have a real world application. These researchers didn't look at how massage was being actually used by athletes. So my conclusion on massage is there's very little good research right now on whether it is or is not beneficial.
And how do you feel about the other modalities? What's your thoughts on cryotherapy?
So that one was one where there was some very good research done. And the more I have read about it, the more that is something that should be avoided. We should not be icing. The only exception is when you have a really bad injury where you have extreme inflammation, then a little bit of icing to get some of that inflammation down may help. But this idea of if you have any sort of injury, you need icing multiple times per day and you need icing for weeks, or this idea of you should be into these ice baths are not beneficial. They're trying to bring down inflammation, and this is actually a good segue to the other thing that I found really interesting in the research. Inflammation is actually a very important part of both healing from injury and adapting to exercise. And when you try to prevent inflammation, you're actually hurting the repair and adaptation process. And they have shown with cryotherapy that if you're injured and you do a lot of icing, you do a lot of cold therapy, the healing process gets slowed to the point that you actually then get scarring in the muscle tissue.
Very interesting. And so what about compression gear?
That one kills me. I admit I didn't have a ton of backing behind. Well, so yeah, I had a little. The biomechanics lab that I worked at, we were asked by Pearl Izumi to test some of their new compression clothing. And they really wanted us to come back and say, it's great. They just wanted to put it on their website. We've done testing and it's beneficial. And we came back to them and said, it doesn't do a thing. The reason being, you have a pretty thick dermal layer that's actually quite spongy. And with most compression clothing, the sponginess of your dermal layer is going to absorb that compression. And it's really not going to get down to deeper blood vessels. And that's what we found with their clothing. So there wasn't really a benefit. Compression clothing, the true grade compression clothing that hurts. You need compression clothing where you need help putting it on. When you are using that sort of compression clothing, yes, there is a lot of benefits.
But who wears that?
more and more athletes are learning that and getting it. Or when they buy the compression clothing, if they would normally wear medium, they'll buy a small and really try to get it on. And the other thing is the studies I read where they found benefits of compression clothing, it wasn't put it on for 20 minutes after a race. It was they had the athletes wearing the clothing for 24 to 48 hours, like they were sleeping in it.
Right. Okay.
And then you saw benefits.
I could talk to you about this all day, but I'm wary of your time. That's really interesting. And I look forward to listening to you and to reading your articles because I want to know more about this. So hopefully you'll do your own studies that are real studies.
I appreciate you saying that. I always hope with every article, every podcast, we give some valuable information.
Absolutely. And I know, I'm going to definitely link to your podcasts as well as your magazine because I've learned so much from them and I know my listeners will love it. So I'll definitely link to that. But before I let you go, Trevor, I just wanted to ask you, do you have a tattoo? I
don't, actually.
Have you ever considered it?
I haven't. I have a unique theory on that, and I don't say it's right or wrong. This is just my personal belief. I am really big on everything I get in life, I feel I need to earn. It's just that sportsman mentality in me of, you want to win a race, you have to do the training to get there. And that's part of why I'm very against doping, because doping, you don't earn it. And so my feeling with my body is anything on my body that's worth looking at, I want to do the work to earn it. And so I'm not in any way against tattoos. They're just not something I have to work for, so they've never really had an appeal.
Wow,
does that make sense?
That's a very unique answer, and it really makes sense to me. It's awesome. Look, Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time, and the only thing I'd request in the future is to find somewhere where you've got good internet access.
Yeah, I apologize. I moved back to Canada 2 years ago, and I love Canada. I'm Canadian. I love my country, but we're a little behind on a few things. One of them is the internet here is not good.
That's right. Look, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you and meeting you.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.